Okay, so what we'll do now is we're going to look at a text and we're going to put those principles into action. We're going to apply these principles. And so we're going to the book of Ruth and Ruth chapter 1. So I'll give you a moment to turn to Ruth chapter 1. So Ruth chapter 1, and we'll look at the first 6 verses. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. So that's our text. So now we'll go through the different steps that we need to go through in order to interpret this text correctly. So the first thing we would do as we approach this text is to read through the book of Ruth in one setting. And we're lucky this is not a long book. This is only 4 chapters. So this is something that's definitely manageable. So that's the first thing that we would do. Then the second step, we would read through the book again and we would make note of divisions. Another option, if you're not very good at this, and I understand that this takes practice, what you can do is you can go to some of the resources that I've mentioned. Probably if you have a study Bible, in the beginning, before that particular book, in this case the book of Ruth, there will probably be an introduction that will give you the divisions in the book of Ruth. Or you can go to websites like BibleStudyTools.com. This is what I did in this case, just to save some time. So here's a division of the book of Ruth. So first we have an introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Then we see, starting in verse 6 through 22, that Naomi returns from Moab. Within that there is some division. 6 through 18 we see that Ruth clings to Naomi. And then 19 through 22 we see that Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. Then we have a third section, which is chapter 2, where Ruth and Boaz meet in the harvest fields. Again, that can be divided into some smaller sections. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, Ruth begins to work. Verses 8 through 16, Boaz shows kindness to Ruth. And then verses 17 through 23, Ruth returns to Naomi. Then we get a fourth section, which is chapter 3, where Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz's threshing floor. Again, we have some divisions there. Verses 1 through 5 in chapter 3, Naomi instructs Ruth. Then chapter 3, verses 6 through 15, Boaz pledges to secure redemption. And verses 16 through 18, Ruth again returns to Naomi. Then we get to the fifth section, which is chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, where Boaz arranges to fulfill his pledge. So first, in verses 1 through 8, he confronts the unnamed kinsman. And then in verses 9 through 12, Boaz buys Naomi's property and announces his marriage to Ruth. Then in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, we have somewhat of a conclusion, which is the opposite of the opening. Because in the opening, Naomi is really, in a very bad position. She's lost her husband, she's lost her sons. And here, she finally feels that God has taken care of her. And then verses 18 through 22 is an epilogue. It's kind of an afterthought, and we find the genealogy of David, which helps us to understand how the book of Ruth fits in with the whole Old Testament story. Okay, so as we look at our text a little more closely, This is our third step. We find that in verse 1 it says, in the days when the judges ruled. So this tells us something about when this story takes place. So the Israelites left Egypt. Under the leadership of Moses, they spent 40 years in the desert. They get to the borders of the promised land. Moses dies, and Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. For the most part, they take possession of the promised land, not 100%, but for the most part. And then afterwards, after the book of Joshua, we get to the book of Judges. So the judges were really local rulers who were ruling Israel. And depending on whether the judge was actually following God or not, the people were following God or not. So this story of Ruth takes place during that time of the judges. So it's almost as if somewhere you could insert this story into the book of Judges. And so we know, and I found this in BibleStudyTools.com, but we figured this out by reading the story, that the book is named after one of its main human characters, which is a young woman of Moab, Ruth, and she is actually the great-grandmother of David, and she becomes one of the ancestors of Jesus. If we go to Ruth 4:21-22, will tell us that she was a great-grandmother of David. And if we go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it will also tell us that she's in the ancestry of Jesus. So as we read these 6 verses, and actually really all of chapter 1, we figure out that this first chapter kind of sets up the story. Chapter 1 introduces us to 2 of the 3 main human characters in this story, Naomi and Ruth. And this chapter explains how Ruth, who is from Moab, who is not an Israelite, she's from Moab, ends up in a tiny town of Bethlehem. And the first 6 verses explain why Naomi in the first place went to Moab. It explains how she lost her husband, and then how she lost her 2 sons, and that before that, those 2 sons each married a Moabite woman. The culture of that day, looking at the cultural background, the culture of that day helps us to understand that Naomi, when her husband has died and her 2 sons have died, she's really without financial support. Because a woman depended on her husband to provide for her, and if the husband died, then she depended on the male children. If she only had women, then she would depend on the sons-in-law. So Naomi had 2 sons, but the sons also died. So Naomi is left with two daughters-in-law, and basically the 3 of them have no way to survive. So that kind of helps us to understand the cultural setting, and perhaps helps us to understand part of the reason why Naomi wants to go back to her own people, because at least there she can find a relative who would help her financially and support her. So next step, we talked about the 3 levels of a story. Okay, so we'll first take a look at the top story, the top level. The top level is about God's relationship with all people. And the end of the book of Ruth tells us that Ruth and Boaz were the ancestors to David, and they were therefore also ancestors to Jesus. Matthew 1:5 confirms this. So this is on that top level where we see that this is all part of God's plan of salvation. You know, through their descendants, the Messiah will come to earth, and the Messiah will bring salvation for all people. So that's the top level, God's relationship with all people. Then the middle level is about God's relationship with Israel, and there again it's pretty much the same thing. God has promised a Messiah for the Israelites. The people are waiting for this Messiah, and this Messiah will come through the lineage of Ruth and Boaz. And then the bottom level, which is God's relationship with the individuals in this story. And here we see that basically God uses tragic events such as the death of a husband and even children to bring about his will. That's a little bit running ahead, but that in terms of application, but we'll come back to this, and there are some other lessons in this narrative as well. So then the last question is, what are the eternal truths that we can learn from these opening verses? Okay, at first sight, when we read this, we might think, well, wait a minute, what does this story have to do with me? Other than the fact that Jesus, that Ruth and Boaz are ancestors to Jesus. What is there in this story that I can apply in my life? Okay, and so here I'm taking a shot at this from verse 1 and 2. We could say that when times get tough, you may need to make a decision that is to the benefit of yourself and those you love. Okay, so here are Naomi's husband, Naomi, and her two sons, a family of four. There's a famine in Israel, which tells us that most likely, again, tying this in with the covenant relationship that God had with Israel, it's very likely that at this time the Israelites were not following God. Okay, so the people around them were not following God. Whether they were or not, we don't know. But the price everybody pays for this is that God withdraws his blessing. As a result, there is a famine in the land. That's a direct statement in the covenant where God said, well, if you don't worship me, I will bring famine, I will bring pestilence, things are not going to go well with you, Israelites. So in the beginning, in the first verse where it says, that this happened at a time when there was a famine in the land, that gives us a clue that spiritually the Israelites were not following God. Okay, so people are facing this difficult situation. There's a famine, there's not enough food. Well, what do Naomi and her husband do? They make the decision to leave and travel to another country, basically, to go and make a living there and find a place to live where there is food. So, same with us today. When times get tough, sometimes we may have to make a decision that is to the benefit of ourselves and those that we love. Okay, second thing that we can learn from verses 3, 4, and 5 is that even though you make a decision to benefit yourself and those that you love, that doesn't mean that everything is going to work out fine. Okay? There's absolutely no indication in this text that Elimelech and Naomi made the wrong decision. There is no judgment there to say they should not have left. They weren't trusting God. There's nothing of the sorts. Okay? If we would say that, we would read that into the text, because that's not there. And even though they made that decision to go and travel from Israel to Moab because there was food in Moab, bad things happened to them in Moab. Elimelech died, and then 10 years later, the two sons died. So this isn't exactly a story that you would say, wow, things are working out great. So that's a lesson that we can learn from this, that even though we make the right decision at times, that doesn't mean everything is going to work out just fine. Okay, we like to think it would, but not the case. And then from verse 6, I think that we could learn that when the situation changes again, a return to a previous arrangement or location may be necessary. So that's exactly what Naomi does. She had left Israel with her husband, with her sons, moved to Moab. Her husband died, her sons grew older. They married two women from Moab. And then her sons died, and so the whole situation is turned around again. She's again faced with difficulty, but then she hears that God has had mercy on his people. There is food again in Israel, so she decides to leave. Again, there is the change of situation, and she decides to go back to where she came from. Now, notice that in each of these statements, in each of these applications, I'm saying, this is something that we may have to do, okay? Because again, this is one of those errors we want to avoid. We don't want to say that what these people did or what Naomi and Ruth did in this story is automatically what we need to do. So it's not because they did that's automatically the decision that we need to take. So I think in everything we need to depend on how God leads. We need to listen to his word. We need to know his will. And we need to figure out what God's will is and go from there and be obedient. So I'm hoping that this example will help you in understanding the Old Testament narratives, and that it will help you read through those stories and see that, yes, there are truths that we can gain from them, even though these stories are, took place thousands of years ago in a totally different culture, totally different setting. But it is God's word to us, and there are things that we can learn from this.